Hello everyone and welcome back to Quantifiers. Today's passage that we'll be reading has a very common kind of a topic that we are all very much aware of, which is the domain of education. In this particular passage, we'll be talking about the history of education, we'll be talking about the sociological implications of education. Let us read through the passage to gain further understanding. Now, because it is coming purely from social sciences, there might be a lot of words that may have a very difficult kind of maybe an interpretation. So for such passages, it becomes very imperative that you should have a decent vocabulary base. Let us read through the passage. A disinterested love of scholarship was understandably a weaker draw for those pursuing careers outside teaching itself. Students of law were especially notorious for a hard-nosed careerism at a time when jurisprudence had earned itself the label of money-making discipline, and mastery of it offered the surest route to swift promotion within the hierarchies of both church and the state. Medicine too dangled its own financial rewards before ambitious students. Those who bypassed both law and medicine could still, provided that they had been properly schooled in the liberal arts, secure posts attached to royal households or climb up the ecclesiastical ladder. Now, what is ecclesiastical? It is something which is related to the church. A striking illustration of how thoroughly self-interest had infiltrated, that is seeped through, 20th century schooling comes from a pupil of Abelard who complained around 1150 that families sent their sons to be educated chiefly so that a son who became a clergyman, that is working at a church, could later support his parents and siblings financially, since a clergyman having no legitimate heirs of his own would leave whatever he accumulated to his relatives. So basically in the first 3-4 lines, we are talking about the profession of law as to how majority of people wanted to pursue law because it was financially very rewarding. Some of the others wanted to pursue science or probably the whole discipline of medicine because again, they felt that it is going to be something that is going to be very ambitious for them. There was a third strata whereby the ones, if they were properly schooled in the liberal arts, could become clergymen. That is, they could work with the church so that whatever financial rewards they had with them, they could leave it for their relatives. As openings multiplied in law, administration, and the church, education came to function as a ladder not merely for wealth but for social standing as well. It remained true that the majority of the educated were drawn from prosperous families, yet 20th century society, more than any other early period, allowed for a meaningful number of humbly born individuals to climb through sheer scholarly achievements. The best known are Thomas Becket, who moved from modest origins all the way to Chancellorship of England and later the Archbishopric of Canterbury, and John of Salisbury. Born a commoner who nonetheless died holding the Bishopric of Chartres or the strength of his scholarly renown. So basically in this particular paragraph, if you look at the second half of the paragraph, what are we talking about in the second half? From this line till the end, we are majorly talking about the fact that as the openings they multiplied in law administration, it was inundated. But generally it was believed that it was for the people who were coming from good families financially, right? From very prosperous families. But at the same time, eventually the posts open for the people who are coming from humble families. And we are given the example of Thomas Becket as to how he finally died holding the title of the Bishopric of Chartres, right? The careers of Becket and John of Salisbury led directly to the thorniest puzzle surrounding 12th century schooling. Just how firmly did the church hold education in its grip? Even though the clergymen returned an unbroken monopoly over instruction across the century, the noted medieval historian R.W. Southern has not without justification described the very institutions the clergy ran as secular schools. Reconciling this apparent contradiction, clerical control paired with a secular character requires examining both halves of the claim in turn. When you're talking about the clergymen are the people who are basically working in the churches or in any sort of a religious institution. At one point of time, we are talking about the church was the one who held the education in its group. At the same time, we are talking about the fact as to how the institutions under the clergy were secular. That means they were very open to people other than Christianity. We need to further dig into details in order to understand this fact. Consider first clerical dimension. Every 12th century instructor, with the sole exception of certain craftsmen and specialized professionals, belonged formally to the church. Moreover, across Northern Europe, pupils enrolled in schools carried clerical status and were outwardly indistinguishable from ordained priests. This does not mean that each one had actually taken holy orders, but simply by enrolling as a student, one automatically received the legal protections normally reserved for clergymen. So if I've decided to enroll myself with the church, at the end I formally belong to the church, I'm going to get all sort of legal protections from the church, even though I've not passed out as a clergyman. But because I am studying in their institution, I am legally protected. In addition, outside Italy at least, the great bulk of 12th century students who were not already ordained went on to take orders once their studies concluded. Consequently, the very word cleric came to signify in common usage any man who could read and write, while layman came to mean anyone who not. The English derivative clerk retained for centuries after the sense of student or a literate man, just as modern French clerk still carries overtones of the intellectual. So ultimately, it was assumed that anyone who is a clerk, or anyone, as they say in French, a clerk, if that person is a clerk or has been given this designation of being a clerk, no matter how formally he or she is educated or not, it was assumed that since they can read and write, they basically can be given the derivative of a clerk. Yet alongside this clerical framework, 12th century education was steadily absorbing secular characteristics. अब yet दे रखा है, यहाँ पे पूरा हम लोगों को डिस्क्राइब किया है कि क्यों चर्च का इतना स्ट्रॉन्ग डोमिनेशन था. यहाँ पे हम सेक्युलर कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स की बात करें. अब सेक्युलर वो किस वे में था? In its settings, its aims, and its syllabus. Student life grew visibly less monastic once instruction shifted from monastery walls into the noisy commercial towns. So that means it was not restricted to religious teachings. It was something that was more utilitarian and practical. Most students drifted from one town to another, drawn not merely by reputable teachers, but by the lure of worldly diversions. As the century wore on, Paris increasingly offered both in abundance. Still, more telling than the settling was the fact that the overwhelming majority of students, even those who eventually entered the clergy, pursued essentially worldly ambitions. So see how we are talking about the fact as to how the clergy aspirations were probably being replaced by worldly desires. Theology is when you're talking about the study of God or knowledge of religion and God. Theology may have carried the honorific title of Queen of Sciences, yet only a small minority ever advanced to study it in earnest. The rest treated their grounding in the liberal arts merely as a stepping stone towards law, medicine, administrative service, or promotion within the church hierarchy. Given this, the liberal arts syllabus itself grew steady, more intricate, and steadily less tethered to religious purposes. Instruction persisted almost entirely in Latin, and the Psalter remained the customary first text for beginners, but education beyond the elementary stage no longer resembled the training given in monastic choir school. So basically, eventually what happened, everything was being replaced from the foundation level till the peak of it, from the monastic choir school to something that was more utilitarian and worldly. Rhetoric in particular was shaped from a purely linguistic exercise into practical instruction on drafting letters and official documents. अब देखो उनका लैंग्वेज भी चेंज हो गया, रीडिंग स्टाइल भी चेंज हो गया, राइटिंग अब सिर्फ आपका लिंग्विस्टिक एक्सरसाइज नहीं था, बल्कि ऑफिशियल डॉक्यूमेंट्स कैसे लिखने हैं वहां पे पहुंच गया था. Logic received unprecedented emphasis, and across the liberal arts and philosophy generally, texts of a far more advanced character than anything known earlier in the medieval period were brought into the use. This growing emphasis on logic went hand in hand with a wave of translation. Ab translation we start honi shuru ho gayi. Greek and Arabic works of philosophy and science were rendered into Latin. Chief among these was the recovery of nearly the entire Aristotelian corpus, together with the sophisticated commentaries of his Arabic interpreters, a development that helped trigger an intellectual upheaval grounded in Greek rational inquiry. On a more everyday level, contact with the Arab world brought the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, along with the concept of zero, into the 12th century Europe. Although most Europeans initially balked at this innovation, that is thwart karna, obstruct karna, mocking the zero as a number that supposedly counts for nothing, yet insists on being counted. The new system gradually took hold first in Italy and then across the rest of the continent, dramatically easing the burdens of calculation and record keeping. So basically, see the whole passage, the thought of the whole passage is how initially everything was related to law, science, clergy. Then we are talking about two dimensions, clergy versus something that is very secular. Then we are talking about secular because the curriculum was something that was very secular, very open. And then because of the curriculum, further came two fields. One was people who wanted to be clergy, so the ethics were related to that, but the education was revolving somewhere around the worldly desires. So this is what the whole of the passage is all about, as to how education in the medieval times grew from the monastic education to something that was more utilitarian. Now coming to the questions of the passage. Question number 1. As per the passage, the growing secular character of liberal arts syllabus in the 12th century is best explained by which of the following? अब पैराग्राफ 4 में हमारे को लिबरल आर्ट्स में मेंशन किया है. ए पॉइंट बोलता है the syllabus had been formally stripped off. It was not stripped off. ये तो यहीं से आपका जो है नेगेट हो गया. It was not stripped off. Syllabus जो है थोड़ा secular हो गया था अप्रोच में. ऐसा नहीं था. It was stripped off the religious element. क्योंकि हमें बताया है जो एलिमेंट्री लेवल है वहां तक तो वो था, उसके बाद में जो है उसका यूसेज कम हो गया था. So it cannot be option number 1. Most students approach the liberal arts chiefly as a stepping stone towards fields such as law and medicine. Very clearly we have been told कि जितने भी हमारे overwhelming majority of students थे, उन्होंने क्या किया, शुरुआत में they entered the clergy, and जब उनके worldly ambitions आए, तब उन्होंने liberal arts को जो है as a stepping stone इस्तेमाल किया to open their doors for law, medicine and the administrative service. So B makes a lot of sense. Instruction had by 12th century ceased to deliver predominantly in Latin. Option number C क्या बोलता है? ये factually incorrect है, क्योंकि ceased नहीं, it was all converted rather into Latin. It almost persisted into Latin, right? Latin से फिर हमने जो है Greek and Arabic में जो है आना शुरू किया. So C भी नहीं. Elements of the Arabic language were formally incorporated into standard curriculum. Looks very plausible, लेकिन they were translated. और जो उसके elements थे, वो हमने add नहीं किया था. So they were not added into the standard curriculum. They were only used as tools of translation. So the correct answer for question number 1 is option number B. Coming to question number 2. According to the author, the pursuit of higher education in 12th century was driven mainly by the fact that why did people wanted to follow higher education? Why did people want to follow higher education? Paragraph 1 ने clearly हमारे को बोला है कि it was not just a ladder, right, for wealth, but social standing के लिए भी जो है लोगों ने पढ़ाई करना शुरू किया. Functioned as a route to greater wealth and elevated social rank. Absolutely correct. तभी law के बारे में बोला है, clergymen के बारे में बोला है, and field of medicine के बारे में बोला है. Created learning opportunities specifically for those who were already affluent. It did. But at the same time, we have been given examples of people who were coming from a very humble background. Provided a cherished refuge for individuals with genuine passion for scholarship. हम लोगों को पूरे उसमें ये बोला है कि genuine passion नहीं था, क्योंकि पहली लाइन में ही word disinterested का इस्तेमाल किया है. Disinterested का मतलब है when you are not passionate about something, you're doing it just because you have to do it. Translated in every case into immediate rise in a person's income. Out of scope. There wasn't an immediate rise. We have been told there were some who were already very rich, and कुछ जो है पढ़ाई इसलिए कर रहे थे because they wanted to become rich. So this is very extreme. So the correct answer for question number 2 is option number A. Coming to question number 3, the passage characterizes 12th century schools as simultaneously clerical and secular. क्लरिकल था क्योंकि वो उसी पैटर्न पे चल रहा था, सेक्युलर इसलिए क्योंकि उसका करिकुलम जो है वो बहुत ज्यादा सेक्युलर हो गया, right? It had a secular character because the aims and the syllabus and the settings had changed. A says a number of instructors were craftsmen and professionals who stood entirely outside the church structure. Doesn't make sense. It is just mentioned as a minor detail, but that is again regarding the instructors. It is not capturing the central paradox of why institutions were called secular schools. Option number 2, although students enjoyed clerical legal privileges and outwardly resembled priests, not all of them had actually taken holy orders. It is a supporting detail about the clerical status of students. But why secular half of characterization? That is not. The word cleric had over time come to mean simply a person who could read and write, rather than somebody who formally tied to the church. Now, factually correct, but this is just focusing on the linguistic aspect of reading and writing. This is again not talking about the fact as to why it was clerical at the same time it was secular. Even as clergy retained sole control over instruction, पढ़ा आपको priest ही रहे थे, clergymen ही थे, जो surroundings, objectives and post content था. Now that had become very worldly in character. So you are taught by a priest who's devoid of worldly character, but he's teaching you something that is more worldly in character. That is the paradox. So hence the correct answer is option number D. That is where a secular outlook comes in. What is best implied by 12th century students' complaints cited in the passage that families educated their sons chiefly so that a clergyman's son future gains would benefit his parents and siblings? क्योंकि हमें क्या बताया है कि इनके कोई हेयर्स तो होते नहीं थे, इनका कोई आगे इस चीज को लेके जाने वाला तो था. You had to study and get into it. So we have been given a very striking illustration whereby somewhere we are talking about the fact कि किस तरह से आपका you were एक self motivated character, right? जहां पे ये चीज बोला गया था कि आप अपने लिए जो है पढ़ाई कर रहे थे, बिकॉज एक लाइन पैसेज में दे रखी थी इन द फर्स्ट पैराग्राफ itself that there was some sort of an infiltration. किस चीज का? सेल्फ इंटरेस्ट का. सेल्फ इंटरेस्ट का क्या इन्फिल्ट्रेशन था? That these people wanted to study somewhere because the education was driven primarily by financial return rather than a religious devotion. अब सन्स का पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से क्यों बोला है? 12th century Christian families tended to function as unusually tightly bonded units. This does not make sense. This is just an overgeneralization. It is not supported by the core of the passage. The underlying motive for educating sons was substantially more financial than it was a devotion to learning for its own sake. Makes a lot of sense. 12th century Christians placed exceptionally high value in securing religious education for their sons. Even though this looks like a very plausible answer, but this is something that has been used as a very contradictory fact. क्योंकि हमारे को ये clearly बोला है कि जो emphasis था वो financial yield पे था, not just becoming a clergyman. So there was not 100% devotion related to the church, but they wanted to earn money so that it could, once the person perishes, the money could be given to the family, as they are not going to have any people who are going to carry forward. Obviously, उनके heirs तो हो नहीं सकते. अगर आप clergyman हो, you cannot marry. If you cannot marry, then obviously आपका जितना भी पैसा है वो किस पे जाएगा? It is going to go to your family once you perish. Relationship between 12th century Christian parents and their sons were fundamentally exploitative in nature. This is what we are assuming and we are believing. Nowhere it has been stated that it was fundamentally exploitative just because there were certain financial pragmatist attitudes to it, right? So the correct answer for question number 4 is going to be option number 3. Now, these types of passages you can exactly expect in the exam where the answer choices seem to be very, very correct, but they may not make a lot of sense to the question that has been asked. One point that you must always remember, that should you feel that you're confused between two answer choices, even though both of them may be factually correct, you have to see as to which fact resonates with the question that has been asked, right? So that's it for today. I'm going to see you in another session with yet another interesting reading comprehension. Till then, keep reading. Thank you.